This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello, this is Breege Burke. Before we get into this week's podcast, I would like to thank my patrons personally. Politi, Jan H., Tanya T., Jeffrey B., Gabby, Helen M., Sunny H., Scott K., JRM, Susie G., B. Lupita, C. Roberts, DS, Jake B., CDV, Ali, V!V, Mary Beth R., Ida B., Eric N., Tana, May, Christine F., Alex C., Samantha G., Alcanet, Teddy O., and Desi Ray. I really appreciate those of you who have joined recently and who have stuck with me over these years. If you are not a patron and would like to support my work or join as a free member, visit patreon.com/Chthonia. Now on to the podcast. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast that deals with the dark feminine. I'm Breege Burke. Now, this week's podcast, just a heads up in advance, I woke up with a sore throat this morning, and I seem to have some kind of, I don't know if it's a sinus infection. It doesn't really behave like a cold, but I kind of have something in the back of my throat that is extremely, like I feel like I'm going to, it's that feeling you get when your body feels like it's going to be sick, in the sense of having like a fever or chills or something like that. So I don't know. There's a little something going on, not really surprising at this time of year. Anyway, I only mention it because I'm hoping that my voice holds out for this podcast. So bear with me if I'm a little slow, or if hopefully I'll be able to get through everything okay without any issue. But just so you know that that's going on. Okay, so all that aside, the subject of this week's podcast is Libitina. Now, Libitina is a Roman goddess that is connected to burials and funerals. And she has quite an interesting, I guess, etymological background, or there's a very interesting discussion around the name, the origin of her name, and the meaning of her name. It's generally assumed that Libitina there is an Etruscan goddess on whom she is based. Now, there is no Libitina in Etruscan mythology that we know of, although there are other goddesses. There is another particular goddess who seems to be, if not exactly the same goddess, there definitely is a close enough similarity that a lot of scholars assume that they are the same, and that is the goddess Alpanu. We are going to talk about Libitina, who she is, and we're going to talk about what her associations are, because it's not just, okay, we're talking about funerals and death, and in fact, undertakers in ancient Rome were known as libitinari, okay, so they're definitely this death and funerary connection, but she's also considered to be connected with the goddess Venus, and Libitina, also they say Libitina, spelled differently, one with an E, one with an I, or Libitina, that these are all also epithets of the goddess Venus. And so Libitina is treated in this way as an epithet of Venus, and the ancient grammarians certainly seem to make that connection. So the kind of discussion over whether this particular deity of death is also connected to Venus seems to be a little contention about it. There seems to be other scholars, certainly when I looked at Britannica, discussion of Libitina, they say, I'll just read it from the website. Libitina was mistakenly identified with Venus Libitina, an Italian goddess of gardens. Libitina may have originally been an earth goddess connected with luxuriant nature and enjoyments of life, because all such deities were connected with the underworld. She also became the goddess of death, that side of her character predominating in later conceptions. Okay, so this gives you a little preview of this idea of Venus as being connected to death in some way. Now, they're saying this is a mistaken identification. Now, I looked at this. It says, written and fact-checked by the editors of Encyclopedia Britannica, and I don't see where the idea that this is a mistaken identification comes from, because literally nothing else that I have researched suggests this. So, I would suggest there's a very good reason why Venus would be associated with a goddess of burials and funerals. And also, there's other aspects of the name of Libitina and also with connection to Alpanu, that has to do with giving freely or giving willingly. So, and all of these different ideas about this, I think, come together to give us a certain picture certainly about ideas about death and maybe about life after death, but also about life itself and its connection to death. And so I think this is all what we're going to discuss here. So let's start by taking apart the different aspects of her name. First, I'll give you a little basic description. There's not a whole lot that is written. The name appears in different places, and the main thing that we see written about Libitina has to do with the days in which there are plagues, and so there's references to the temple of Libitina. Now, okay, we'll start with that, with talking about that. It says the grove or the lucus of Libitina was located, as far as they know, on the Esquiline Hill, as were several religious sites, indicating the area had an unhealthy and ill-omened associations. Now, one thing I do know about the Romans and death is that while they had respect for the dead, it goes back to Sarah Iles Johnson's discussion of death when she talks about to honor and to avert. So the Romans like to keep burials and keep death out of the city. There are other cultures that do not necessarily separate death. For example, a lot of medieval cultures would have, in the cemeteries would not only be in the city, but they would be having the markets and different festivals and things in those cemeteries. So it gives you a different idea about attitude towards death. We do know that the Romans tended to see death as a pollution, and so they wanted the dead, and the festivals that they had that were connected with the dead, they wanted, like the Lemuria and the Parentalia, they wanted the dead. They basically wanted to say, hi, we respect you, please stay over there, like, don't come back. Ovid does talk about a ritual that's usually done at midnight on Parentalia by the father of the house, involving, beans and certain things that are said as beans are like thrown over the shoulder or something, to basically keep the ghosts and the dead ancestors from coming back into the house. So, the Romans were very big on keeping the dead out of the city because they considered death coming into the city to be inauspicious, which, that's not necessarily an illogical thing, but they're definitely, it really does fit in with the whole Roman idea of separation, the idea that I've talked about that before, where not only were they keen on making gender separations clear, but they did draw very, very distinct lines. They were very dualistic in their way of thinking, at least certainly as they're getting into the Republican and Empire kind of periods. You definitely see this indicated in the language, and you see it also in their practices, because there's a whole lot about protecting the gens or the spirit of the Romans, of the city of Rome, and everything that had to be done to guarantee that, and the severe penalties for those who are responsible for things like that, if they did not actually maintain their spiritual obligations, not only within their own households, but also within the city. So there's a whole lot here about the Romans, and certainly, but obviously, if you want to represent yourself, you want to represent your emperor as Sol Invictus, right, the unconquerable sun, then you are definitely looking at a dynamic where anything having to do with death is going to be something in exile from the city. It's not going to be part of the life of the city. Okay, so to move on here. A public cemetery was located outside the Esquiline Gate in the Campus Esquilinus. A temple of Venus in the Grove of Libitina celebrated its founding anniversary on the 19th of August, the day of the Venalia Rustica. When a person died, the treasury of the temple collected a coin as a death tax, supposed to have been established by Servius Tullius, which is one of the original kings of Rome. During a plague in the year 65 AD, or CE as I like to say, 30,000 deaths were recorded at the temple. Livy notes 2 occasions where the death toll exceeded Libitina's capacity. A panel of funeral directors was based in the Grove of Libitina. Okay, so yes, we see that this is a deity associated with death. She has a temple, Esquiline Hill, outside of the city of Rome. There's a death tax collected. This is the place where undertakers do their business. and they also are the official record keepers of death. Romans were very good at keeping records on things. So, so when a person died, this was collected, and obviously there was a hierarchy of when it came to burials and so forth. Obviously, aristocrats and people with money, had the I guess the favored spots over those who were perhaps slaves or people of lower classes who might not have had the money. So it's interesting because we also think about the idea from Greek mythology of Charon, the ferryman who collects a coin when the dead person crosses over into Hades. And the idea of one having to have this coin, now it just seems like it goes into the Roman treasury. So whether there were other practices connected to that idea of the dead person needing a coin to go over the river at that point, I don't know. But so this could be a tax in addition to that. Who knows? In any case, so we see that Libitina has this obvious connection to death. Now, when we think about what Britannica just said about this Venus Libitina not being connected, because Venus is supposed to be they're talking about a goddess of gardens. Okay. But there's a paper written years ago about Venus. It's an interesting title. It's called Venus and the Cabbage. And I had a little bit of a quote from that because the author is P.T. Eden, and it was in a journal called Hermes from 1963, or Hermes from 1963. And he basically is talking about the old etymologies, the ones that were very commonly known in scholarship, that suggested that Venus, in her interpretation, obviously she takes on Aphrodite's characteristics as the goddess of love, but that as a agricultural goddess, that she is different from Aphrodite in that way. But what the article is pointing out is that that Venus is also, that Aphrodite also has an association with vegetation. And it's interesting because they talk about Venus as being associated with cholera, which is like a word for vegetables. There's this this suggestion that she has to do with the agriculture and with things that grow, something that we see associated in Greek mythology, certainly with somebody like Demeter or Rhea, and you have similar beings, agricultural deities. We had talked about Lewis Saturni, who's actually one who can cause blight. And of course, Saturn's role in agriculture. Mars has a role in agriculture. It's not always a feminine role. But then you have Ceres, who is like the Roman equivalent of Demeter, a goddess of grain and things that grow. But Venus does definitely have an association with gardens, with flowers. Libitina is an interesting word because it means to be pleasing, okay? Because this is one of the varieties of that epithet. And they're saying Libitina and Libitina are the same. Now, who says that? Now, Varro is the one who said that. And Varro has very, very questionable etymology, so you can't take him at his word. But this is what Eden says about it. It says, Venus's original powers seem to have been extended largely by the fondness of the Romans for folk etymology and by the prevalence of religious idea of the nomen omen, which sanctioned any identifications made in this way. One of the earliest victims of Venus's assimilative power was none other than Libitina, the goddess of funerals and undertakers. Varro says, and this is in the Latin, ab lubendo libido, libidinosus ac Venus, or Venus really, libentia et libitina. Okay, so he says this, and what that basically means is towards lubendo having to do with being pleasing, or libido, which has to do, therefore, libido then is the word that means kind of to desire something, okay? We know Freud's use of the word libido, but it has to do with that drive or that craving or that desire. And he says, from lubendo, which means to be pleasing, we have the idea of desire, libido, and from libido towards Venus, libitina, and, it's spelled both ways, with an E and then with an I. So this is what Varro says. Now, according to Eden, he says this is not an original etymology of his own. Because that's the thing. The point being is that Varro tends to make up a lot of this stuff. So they're saying, no, this is not something that came from Varro originally. The identification was already known to the age of Calpurnius Piso, the historian, and no doubt goes back much farther, for a temple of Venus was built in the grove of Libitina hardly later than 300 BC, or BCE, as we would say. So, yeah, I think the assertion that Venus Libitina is somehow, the Venus of Gardens is somehow separate from this Venus that is Venus Libitina, or from Libitina, I don't see where they're getting that. Because this all suggests to me that, yes, there's obviously a connection between those. And again, whether we believe those etymologies or not, certainly, like I've said with Varro before, because Varro is the one who says that all masculine words are associated with the sky and all feminine words are associated with the earth, which, again, etymologically is not really correct, but it does tell you something about the beliefs and the understanding of the people at the time, which is why I think that that Venus and Libitina are most definitely connected. Now, let me talk for a minute about Libitina's Etruscan forerunner. Okay, we had talked about this with Louis Saturni and the idea of there was another goddess called Angerona, who originally has kind of an original Etruscan counterpart. She was a goddess that was associated with silence and keeping silent. And the Etruscan goddess who seems to be associated with this is a goddess called Alpanu. Now, it's very difficult to find information on Alpanu, Alpan or Alpanu. There's a discussion that I had read about the suffix, the U suffix that they use. There's a lot in this that kind of reminds me in Etruscan of Romanian, actually, of the way that Romanian words are written. And in fact, I want to bring up this thing on the etymology here of Alpan, because I think this is important. Okay, so the first thing I want to get, because this is actually an article I found on Ankar, who is actually the goddess associated with Angerona. But there is there's another thing that is mentioned here where she says, Ankar associated with riches or income. And in this particular article on Ankar, they say the conditions are different with another word going back to the stem Ankar, that of the Roman goddess Angerona. Ancient documents referring to this deity are rather poor. It's told that the diva Angerona was worshipped at the Curia Aquileia on the Palatine in the temple of Volupia. There a statue representing her with closed mouth and a finger on the lips. Now, we've talked about that. Check out the Louis Saturni podcast for more on that. According to Pliny and Macrobius, this gesture was a warning not to tell the secret names of Urbs Romana, of the Roman city, or of its protecting gods. But it's pointed out and can scarcely be doubted that Angerona belongs to the Tacti Manas and represents an ancient deity of death and the dead. Her festival, too, the Angeronalia or the Divalia, indicates this function, being celebrated in December, a month especially devoted to the cult of Chtonic gods. So they are compared. Then she gets into a comparison here of the names of this goddess, and then she gets into as to Etruscan, Aditi Ankaru would harmonize with cases where the name of a goddess was derived from the appellation, like Alpanu from Alpan. Okay, so this is where Alpan comes into play. The latter word, Alpan, of a meaning somewhat like donum, occurs twice as the name of the goddess, who is generally called Alpanu or Alpnu. We may therefore assume that Ankar, on the above-mentioned patera, functions in the same as that of Lhasa. Now, Lhasa is another deity that is associated with Alpanu. You see Alpanu Lhasa sometimes mentioned. And what's interesting is that this is a deity who was retained in Hungarian mythology, and this was a deity associated with a goddess who gives herself freely and willingly, like a naked goddess who gives herself willingly. Okay, so keep that in mind. So she says, okay, so this is the part that I found interesting. We still have to examine the semantic development. Does it seem plausible that the word belongs to the sphere of fortuna, ops, or fructus, okay, meaning, basically having to do with abundance and good fortune, furnished the name for a deity of the dead or of death? As a matter of fact, the Italic conceptions of the Dei Inferni, which is the gods of the underworld, involve the idea of treasure and wealth. The idea of Pluto coming from Pluton or Plusos, which has to do with wealth, as well as their names and epithets show. Ennius mentions the Sorai Mortis or Orci. Divus is the character adjective connected with these gods. Dis Pater provides a translation for the god, Pluto or Pluton. The popularity of this conception is reflected in a late simile, Divus rusticus qui propter divitas Pluton fui nomen. Finally, the goddess Ops, in her function as a deity of fertility and death, forms a direct parallel to Angerona. And again, I talked about that in the Lewis Attorney podcast. There may have existed a relationship or kind of identity between both that left some traces in ancient tradition. Okay, so, all right, so the idea, then she talks about some other festivals, and then she goes down and says, at any rate, we may draw the conclusion that the name Angerona reflects the Etruscan Ankaru, originally characteristic of a Chtonic deity, whose meaning was no longer understood by the later Romans. And similarly, Alpanu, they was talking about that U ending that you have on that. Both of them are goddesses, Etruscan goddesses, that have to do with the underworld, but they also have to do with fortune. Now, what I could find on Alpan or Alpanu comes from this is thaliatuk.com. This is the Obscure Goddess Online Directory. Because, Alpan is quite obscure. There's not a whole lot. Oftentimes, when you're talking about ancient deities, there might be carvings or inscriptions or different things. That may be the only knowledge that we really have of these deities, and we may learn what their associations are based on, what the Etruscans might have said about them, or how they might have included them in oracles, or how they might appear on these certain artworks. So we're going to read what she says here. Alpan is an Etruscan goddess about whom not much is known. She is probably one of the Lassas. Okay, that's the other thing too. Lassas, in addition to that Hungarian thing, Lassa, this is one of the goddesses of fate. It says one of the fate goddesses who have underworld connections. Like many other Etruscan goddesses, she was often shown bearing great wings. Her name means gift or offering with willingness implied. Perhaps on this basis, the fact that she is usually portrayed free of clothing. She is sometimes called a love goddess. Additionally, others call Alpan a goddess of springtime, who creates the myriad plants that come forth from the ground. Okay, so already you're seeing here. This is the Etruscan deity who is supposedly, who at least scholars have decided is probably the deity connected to Libitina. Okay, and we already see that she is a love goddess. She's associated with spring and flowers and also with the underworld. Okay, which, I don't know. I feel like it's more modern cultures that tries to separate life and death, like one is an anomaly and the other is, like they're not, like they have no connection to each other. And I think it's very obvious that they do. Certainly, if you've listened to this podcast long enough, you know that I definitely see it that way. But it says, in some depictions, she's shown holding bouquets of flowers or leaves. Like Venus, Alpan may have been both a love goddess and a spring goddess, as love and spring do go together nicely. She seems to have survived into 19th century Tuscany as the fairy Alpina, who was also called La Bellaria, which probably translated to the beautiful one of the air. A sprite of the air and light who is the goddess of flowers, spring, and beauty associated with sky, clouds, and rainbow. Yet other sources call Alpan the queen of the underworld or leader of the Lassas, and like Lassa herself, Alpan is sometimes shown carrying an alabastron or perfume jar. Interesting. We always think about Pandora with her jar. These women carrying jars or vessels that they may open up onto something, and that gets to another meaning of the name Libitina, but we'll get there. As the Lassi are considered a group of related fate goddesses, so Alpina of Tuscany is part of a group of winged spirits of the air, collectively called the Bellari, or I'm not sure it's Bellari or Bellari or Belair. She may also be related to Thesan, the goddess of the dawn. Okay, so this is what we know about Alpan. She's an underworld goddess, and she's also a god of love and spring and flowers and things like that. So if we go back to what Wikipedia says, it says Libitina is sometimes regarded as Etruscan in origin, and the name might derive from the Etruscan lupu, which means to die. And of course, we talked about Varro's etymology, that he said connection, libido, that connects it to Venus. But Francis Wood was another etymologist who tried to connect Libitina to to the idea of libari or libations. Okay, so that's why I mentioned the jars and the idea of having a vessel that is kind of poured out, because you make libations to the gods at different times. But also the idea of emptying what has been full, right? And if we go back to the idea of the jar that is opened and, what is in it is released on the world, which again, we're not saying that the fates are the same as Pandora, but it's a different conception. And in Greece, you have the idea of fate as being three spinning women. You have Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos, who spin the thread of life. They measure it and then they cut it. Here we have these idea of these winged deities who are associated with this idea of something that gives freely or willingly. And they carry with them, the jars of fate. So there's almost an implication of a freely giving of abundance, but obviously they also have a connection to the underworld and to death as well, because nobody lives forever. They said the Etruscan formula Alpan Turce or Terce is equivalent to a libens dedit, to give freely or willingly. Okay, and this was the epithet that was often associated not only with Alpanu but also with Libitina. Okay, so let's take a step back here. We know who she is. We've talked about her etymology. She's considered to be, there's this idea of her as a goddess of voluptuous delight and also a goddess of funerals. We have one source that says, oh no, they're not the same. Libitina and Libitina are not the same. Okay. I have my doubts about that, and being that no sources were shown to me other than, oh yeah, the editors checked it and they know what they're talking about. Okay, I mean, Britannica usually is a very credible source, but I would like to see what that scholarship is or where it comes from. To me, it sounds like they're putting forward one scholarly opinion about the etymology and not necessarily the decisive one. And again, I think scholars... I remember one of my colleagues, one of my department chairs, had spoken to me one time about more modern scholarship on some of these ancient gods or on ancient goddess cults and things like that. And he said, oftentimes, the problem with some of the modern scholarship is that they're trying to look at it, as a modern person with modern values and beliefs and narrative structures, and that But you really do, if you're able to look at it in context, you really should. What was said about these things at the time. Again, even if what was said, even if the stories that are told are false, there are false grammars and there are histories that where they have events that are not proven, but nonetheless, you are getting a flavor of how these events were seen, whether the person was seeing them in a factual way or not. And I think when people write more modern scholarship and attempt to separate things, so for instance, if you think that the idea of a goddess of joy and love and sex and fertility could have absolutely nothing to do with death, I don't know. I recently did a podcast with John Wilson. He does a Substack called Jung in the World, and he does do interviews. And so we did an interview a couple days ago, and we were talking about the Eros and Psyche myth. And one of the things I said to him, we were talking about the ideas of death or Psyche going into the underworld. And I have said it, I think there's a very close connection between Thanatos and Eros. It's kind of my own belief too. But I feel like love and death and desire in death. There used to be the idea in the Middle Ages of when one had an orgasm, that the orgasm was what they would refer to it as a little death. And not just for that. I think in the midst of life, in other words, death is an integral part of life, and it's part of the things that are connected to the enjoyment of life, which seems weird to us because death we look at as, well, no, I've lost something, or something's gone, or now I don't have it anymore, and now I'm alone, or I feel sad, or all of these things that we associate in that way when we have lost something or when something has come to an end. But there's also the idea that when things come to an end, that something else begins. If we think about the myth of Aphrodite and Adonis, or Venus and Adonis, what does she do with Adonis? He he is her lover and he's with her, but then when he gets killed in a boar hunt, she takes his blood and makes it into a flower, the Adonis flower. And so this is why I say the idea that Aphrodite had no vegetative associations. I was like, well, yeah, she did perform resurrection, we call it the dying and resurrecting vegetation god myth, where you have usually the young man who is cut down and then resurrected as some kind of a tree or animal. I mean, Ovid's Metamorphoses certainly contains some of these stories. It's about the way in which out of death comes another form of life, or that death is averted by becoming part of another form of life, perhaps that's going to live longer. Where you see people being turned into trees and things like that. There's definitely this strong connection between life, death, and vegetation. I mean, yeah, there's the paradox of life that we can't live unless something dies. And, either if you're talking meat, then you're talking livestock that has to die. If you're talking about, but even if you're not a person who eats meat, vegetation is a living thing. It has to be cut down. It's a beautiful thing that is therefore cut down in order to sustain life. So I don't think that there's quite the separation between life and death that we tend to see now. We try to reinterpret these deities and say, oh, well, they couldn't be a deity of agriculture and of death, or, oh, they can't be about love and happiness and of funerals. I mean, But, I always think about the fact, too, that in dream symbolism, when people dream about weddings, they may also be dreaming about funerals, or vice versa. There's often a close connection, at least psychologically and symbolically, between those things, because they all represent transformations of some kind. Now, we also have this concept, we have the libation, the idea of pouring out, and I think that also connects in with the idea of, we have voluptuous delight, but then we also have giving willingly. And it's like, okay, so where does that idea fit in, to give willingly? And if we see in the name of Libitina or Libitina, this idea of delight and of giving willingly, but also this association with death, it's interesting to me because it's, first of all, to give something willingly. These are deities that are shown naked. And the implication there is it's almost what we would call in our more moralized cultures, like that of the woman who is, quote unquote, loose, right? Who gives of herself, who gives her the fruits of her of her body, or gives her body as an enjoyment, for her own enjoyment and for the enjoyment of others. That's implied there. When we talk about that which is voluptuous or seductive, Venus's son is Priapus, who is known for having being extremely well endowed, having a member that's probably larger than his body. But yet you have this idea of nature as being something that is just, very sexual, very sexualized. And so there's a lot of discussion of the enjoyments of that. It also makes you wonder about Libitina as connected to liber. Now, etymologically, those two words are not connected. Liber and and Libitine are not they're not from the same root. Okay, but nonetheless, this LIB root, we still do have this idea, this Libens dedit, to give something freely. So the idea of liberty is also tied up in there, because also in that voluptuous enjoyment is often the drinking of wine. So we see an association not only with Dionysus and Bacchus, but another name of Bacchus, which is Liber, okay? And that connotes an idea of freedom in some fashion. So, yeah, the idea is there. The etymology is not there, but the idea is there. So you have this idea of freedom, you have this idea of giving willingly, and you have this idea of love, but you also have this idea of death, funerals, and mourning. Because sometimes Libitina is referred to as bitter Libitina, right? The bitterness of death. When we think about love, love is usually considered to be bittersweet, right? As much as it causes pleasure, it also causes pain. I think you also, in terms of the freedom, I'm reminded of something that Joseph Campbell said. If you watch The Power of Myth, I think it's the episode on love goddesses, but I feel like I rewatched that one and I couldn't find where he said this, so it might be somewhere else in the series. But he made the comment about love. What is the highest kind of love? So we talk about all different kinds of things. We talk about friendship, okay? Then we might talk about romantic love or lust, things like that, love of physical pleasure or, being attracted to someone based on physical beauty and things like that. Then you have these platonic ideas like, Aphrodite, Urania, closer to ideas of platonic love, where I love you not just for your body, but for your mind, right? You are somebody who I love, for not just your physical appearance. Then he talks about the love. So, for example, what you'll see in the church, they talk about a spiritual love, right? They used to talk about Christian agape, right? The brotherly love between people. But then you would also talk about, say, like he gave the example of nuns as the brides of Christ, right? But there's this obedient and subservient love that one might have in basically giving oneself over to a higher force, like obedience to this kind of higher ideal that is connected to love, or this higher, this what we can call God, whatever we mean by that term. But he said to Bill Moyers, what do you think the highest kind of love is out of those? And of course, you would think that the more spiritual, that of the saint or whatever is the highest kind of love. And he says, no, actually, it's the love of the prostitute, because the prostitute gives her body and gives her love without any regard for social status or reputation. And that's the thing. To truly give freely is to say, I don't care about how I look to other people. It's where we sidestep the judgment of the animus that says, oh, well, you'd better watch your reputation, and you'd better watch this, and you'd better watch that. It's the love that says, I'm just here, love me. I'm here, and I don't care about, how this looks to other people. And that's a rather interesting statement because ultimately that is because a lot of times, okay, when we do engage in certain contracts associated with love, and I say contracts like marriage is a contract, or when we are in a relationship where we are monogamous, or even, I don't know, I suppose it can happen in polygamous relationships too, but the idea that there is an assumed type of relationship between the people involved. There's a quote-unquote contract. If you're in a monogamous relationship, the assumed contract is, okay, we're dating each other, maybe having sex with each other, and not with other people, right? So there's different ways of looking at this, but there's always an ethical component to it in the sense of, you have to provide something. If I'm going to, there's a condition of the love, in other words. Now, some people might point to motherly love as unconditional, but that's, I don't know, that's kind of a different idea. And motherly love can, like a lot of things, it can be something that is, I don't know. I think motherly love has more conditions than one might think. I don't think that in the aspect of the motherly feminine, there are sides of it that are nurturing and caring and want to provide and want to protect, but then there are other sides that may be, that if you take that to its logical extent, is that there's the idea of devouring and losing one's individuality and so forth. This is more the idea of somebody who chooses to give love freely, not because, this is my child and there's some kind of an obligation to my child, or, the hormones make me, want to, protect this child with my life, which is, which often happens in a mother-child bond. But this is a different kind of a love, because it's a love that, when I often talk about the archaic gods as not having any morality, it's that kind of a love. It's a love that says, this is not about ethics and proper, I love you if you engage in proper behavior. It's a love that says, I don't care about proper behavior and I don't care what people think of me. But it's something that's done because one wants to, not because, I don't know, because somebody is just trying to, it's not, it's very unselfish in the sense that it's just like, okay, we're just going to have this, whatever tomorrow brings. And, again, regardless of what the wider world thinks. There's a lot here about the implied social contract between the individual and the group. And this is something that transcends that bond. It breaks that taboo. It breaks that bond of, what is expected of you socially in a love situation. So what does this have to do with? So let's kind of back up here. So when you do that, when you violate a kind of taboo or social taboo, and of course anybody, we read about women who are sex workers and things, and the kinds of things that they have to go through because people don't consider them to be respectable, right? And they're not respectable women. Not much really said about the men who would engage them, right? But, nonetheless, there's the idea of respectability, right? Feminine respectability. That's the thing that is always held over a woman, even by other women, about, judging what's proper behavior with regard to love, with regard to sex, and with things like that. So when you talk about, if you want to compare that to the earth, it's like the earth, you plant the seeds, it gives its fruit freely. It doesn't say, no, I don't like you, so I'm not going to grow for you, or I'm only going to grow for you if you, do these three things. Yes, there's certainly rituals that you have towards fertility deities to appease them and to make sure that you maintain that friendship. But strictly speaking, the earth gives of her abundance, and and gives it very freely to anyone. There's not a consideration here of reputation or anything like that. Fertility is just things happen, and pleasure, voluptua. Pleasure is a different thing. Sex and pleasure don't necessarily have to go together. Reproduction and voluptuous pleasure are not necessarily two things that belong together. And here we might be looking at the idea of the pleasures of earthly life, Chtonic pleasures. So it's the pleasure of making love, the ecstasy of making love, and everything that goes along with it, all the rich and beautiful things that go along with it, may be connected to this idea of Pluton, as was mentioned in that in the other article, and the idea of Pluton as the what constitutes wealth, what constitutes abundance. And there's not a separation of those ideas there. The same things that bring life are the same things that bring death, and we rejoice in all of them. And all of them are there to be pleasing. The world in springtime is something beautiful and pleasing. But even in death, those of you who love autumn, death can be beautiful and pleasing too. So so with Libitina, we have this death deity who is connected to Venus, who seems to be connected to Alpanu. And I think we spend a lot of time kind of musing over whether or not trying to parse out one aspect of Libitina from another. I see scholars trying to do this, but the fact that you see that the ancient Romans will say no, that this deity that has to do with death is also connected to desire. Now we could get into Freud's death drive, right? But again, I think it has more to do with the fact that there's less of a strong line between love and death than we think. And I think I want to kind of finish up by reflecting on how that has appeared in Western culture. When you have a narrative of your culture, and I go back to the biblical narrative, because regardless of whether you practice a Bible-based religion or not, it's definitely a narrative that has influenced Western culture and our thinking about death. Like, for example, if you don't believe, and by the way, most churches don't literally believe, or at least most major churches don't literally believe in the idea of Adam and Eve in the garden, because I don't think the story is meant to be that. Nonetheless, that particular narrative defines the way that we look at the world. The world is something that has been corrupted. The idea that that death has come into the world is a sin and a mistake. It's a deception, right? Instead of viewing it as a part of life, it's a mistake. It's an error, and now you must live your life in labor and suffering and shame because of this error. And that's a narrative that we've internalized. And we may not be the only ones. You have the idea in Buddhism as well, the idea that all human life is suffering, that there's some other kind of an ideal that's somehow better than this life. But I think that, and I think that's the way we interpret that Buddhist idea in the West, is we kind of tend to look at it in that same way, whether it's really intended to mean that or not. But we tend to look at everything in terms of shame. When Adam and Eve are able to recognize each other as different, they cover their shame. And before that, they are, quote unquote, naked and unashamed. Okay? So we are talking about this state. And really, I said, if you want to really parse that out, it's like, okay, the state while they were with God is one where they don't have any reason to be ashamed of their nakedness. So why do they have to now? Because now they're in the realm of time and the realm of death. And somehow we treat being in the realm of time, connected to Saturn also, as Chronos, which is not the only aspect of Saturn, but if we think about that connection, that seems to be the thing. And I think that's why astrologically we tend to associate Saturn/Chronos with suffering, because it has to do with time. It has to do with mortality, the things that come to an end. But even Saturn is a deity. I mean, the Saturnalia is the festival that happens around Christmas time, right? The Chtonic deities are celebrated, and they're celebrated with the fruits of the earth and enjoyment and pleasure. You know, these are not deities that are sad. Saturn also rules over the Golden Age. I mean, we don't. It's very hard for us to conceptualize because we have this idea that death is an evil, that it's corrupted. Then you have the New Testament idea from St. Paul as Christ conquered death. And James Hillman talks about this extensively in his book, The Dream in the Underworld, which I recommend. It is a bit of a, I don't know, you have to kind of bear with it in terms of the read, but if you follow Jungian thought and so forth, you'll find this to be a really interesting read, the way that Hillman talks about all of these things. But yeah, because he talks about the fact that when you reject death, you give up the soul. You are rejecting the soul in favor of pneuma, which is spirit, something that is transcendent and beyond here, and you are giving up your soul and you're giving up enjoyment of this life here on earth. So, so I think this is about that enjoyment, which later on, in a more biblical context, becomes, I think of Proverbs, the loose woman who will bring you down to Sheol, right? The woman who will give you pleasure but is also connected with death. And we interpret that in a negative way, like it's a warning, like don't get involved with her because that's going to lead to death, right? But I don't think it's understood that way, certainly not by the Etruscans. Now, if the Romans understood it this way, we think about this other account that I was reading that, who actually wrote that article? Eva Faisal is one who wrote this article called The Etruscan Ankar. And yeah, I think what you're talking about is a idea about ideas of death goddesses as connected to love, like that they have a meaning. Libitina, has a meaning that is not, that by the time you get to the Romans, you've already got this very split way of thinking. As I said in the beginning, death is a pollution. Death is something you keep outside. Death does not have any part of the life of the city. And we want to put it somewhere where, we pay the death gods their honor and their respect, but where it's mainly as an act of aversion, to keep these things away from us. We don't mingle with our ancestors. We keep them safely outside the gate. And that is the thing. But at the same, so by the time you get to an empire, you have this idea that, death is a pollution and therefore should have nothing to do with abundance. And I've often said that this is why what you might think of as some of the Judaic ideas that initially the Romans thought were really weird. They were like, ooh, they referred to the Jews as atheists because they refused to worship the emperor. They were like, oh, they don't have any gods. They just have this one, and they're kind of weird that way. I mean, that's pretty much the subtext of what you read when in Roman writings about the Jews at the time. But what I've always said, what they did have in common is that they have a lot of rules. They have a lot of boundaries, and they are very much both cultures that are about discerning separation. Now, that's obviously part of our experience of life, and we have taken that to the nth degree with scientific method and so forth, and then breaking things down to molecules and protons and, what is the building block of this? It's like every time we get a car, we need to disassemble it. That's definitely that way of thinking, and we say, well, this is connected to this, and that's connected to that. And because we have this idea of death as a corruption, the idea of a people that would connect death with abundance seems very strange to us. So anyway, I'm going to end on that note. Thank you so much for listening. I'm glad my voice is mostly held out for this. I've had a few moments that'll probably get edited out that that maybe were a little bit faltering. But if you're interested in Chthonia podcast and the other work that I do, there may be some changes to this work by the end of this year. I'm just going to kind of give people a heads up on that. Whether Chthonia is going to continue into 2026 or not, I have not made up my mind on that yet. So yeah, if you're a Patreon subscriber listening going, wait, you didn't talk about that. I haven't, because that's not something I fully decided. It's going to depend on what happens. I have some big changes coming up this fall, and I may also be shifting my focus a little bit. But you can check out patreon.com/Chthonia if you want to support this work and other work I'm doing. One big project I have is the Institute for the Study of Feminine Myth, which is a school that I'm running right now. I'm just kind of doing little $10 sessions, getting people used to the ideas and the kinds of discussion that we have. We did have one semester last fall, didn't have enough people this past spring, so I just didn't run it. And this summer we're like running some $10 sessions called Thinkers Tavern, which are conversations about some of the topics, because ISFM is really trying to be forward-thinking about a lot of things. Like, we're in the 21st century, we're talking a lot about these stories and these narratives, and how do they fit into the world, or how might they need to be changed. So if you're interested in that, instituteforfemininemyth.org/thinkers-tavern is what I'm doing this summer. I hope you can join me for some of those. I am on Instagram as Chthonia Podcast, one word. It's 2 words on Facebook. And of course, if you're watching me on YouTube, you already know where the channel is, but it's listed as Chthonia, but you can find it under @Chthonia Podcast, one word. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.